Hello and welcome to Legalbytes. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. We don't give legal advice, but we do talk about how the law works and try to look into our crystal ball to see how things might turn out. If you're enjoying this on YouTube, we'd love it if you could like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with friends, all the great YouTube-y stuff. And if you want to listen while out and about, we're now offering our live streams in podcast form where you can leave a rating and review. Links are in the description below, as well as to our clips channel where you can find some of the best clips taken from our live streams. Otherwise, if you want to catch me elsewhere, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so on Locals, Patreon, or by becoming a YouTube member, or by buying some really awesome Legalbytes merch. Again, all links are in the description below. And with that said, let's get into it.
I love that.
So,
I haven't seen that
right.
before. I love that.
All right. I'm glad you like it. Like I was telling you offline before, I'm like, I probably need to shorten that intro, but I still enjoy watching it. It helps having kittens and puppies and stuff on there, right? So, I guess before we get into it, so it's February 1st, which means I am in a promotion for the Dragon's Treasure teas. I am actually in a competition with Eric Hunley, who has another YouTube channel. So there's a link in the description below. We are in a competition to see who can sell more tea from the Dragon's Treasure. So if you go to the link in the description below, you can see it says there's a promo code Legalbytes, so you can get 5% off, and you can also support this channel. So I just wanted to mention that before we get into it. And now let's talk about Joe Rogan and Spotify. Of course, when we had this controversy come out with Spotify and Joe Rogan and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and all these people, and Spotify responded, and then Joe Rogan responded, and we have all kinds of corporate messaging, and we have contracts. I knew that the first person that I wanted to talk to was, of course, Rick Hoeg.
Well, thank you very much. That's very nice of you to say.
So, welcome, Rick.
Thank you for having me. Not my first time here on the Legalbytes channel, but definitely the first time that I've seen that introduction. And yeah, I love it. It puts a smile on my face. I always like judicious use of publicly available materials in order to, of course, transform them to what you want to do in an intro or some other purpose. So I think it's fantastic. And I'm happy to be here talking about not at all controversial things like COVID misinformation, Joe Rogan, Spotify, and corporate dealings in institutional infrastructure. Should be great.
Of course. I'm sure this live stream is already demonetized, but it's fine.
Yeah, I think we already said the magic words. Who knows?
I think so. But hey, why not? I mean, it's an interesting topic. There's a lot of interest around it. And I think that we can have a really interesting conversation about this.
Fantastic. Let's do it.
Great. So, Andy, the game maker, thank you for the first super chat on this live stream. And so let's talk about the background in case for anybody that is not aware of what's going on. So Joe Rogan, of course, has an exclusive contract to have his podcast streamed by Spotify. It's worth, I think, about $100 million, quite literally.
Not bad if you can get it.
Which is, I mean, that's a great deal, right? But he also has probably the biggest podcast in the world, really. So I think it's probably worth that amount. And so, you know, as anyone who has watched his podcast knows, he likes to get into deep conversations with people of all kinds of different stripes, all kinds of different backgrounds. He'll talk to conspiracy theorists, he'll talk to politicians, he'll talk to pretty much anyone that interests him, really. And so recently, you know, he's been talking a lot about the coof and about the coof juice, you know, and so, you know, because he's been very interested in the mainstream media sort of narrative on all of these subjects and on the pandemic and sort of cutting through, I think, what he sees as, you know, maybe a lot of BS. So in the last week, I guess, Neil Young, the rock artist from the 1960s, I guess you could say, he legendary rock artist, I guess you could say.
We don't have to add the superlatives to them. It's very funny, actually, right? Just before we get into the substance, I actually had to. Neil Young's one of those artists from my age. I'm in my 40s, where you say, "Yeah, I know that name, but I couldn't place what he did at all." Joni Mitchell, I actually am more familiar with, which is going to be part of the story.
It's funny.
But Neil Young, it's interesting. We got a very specific kind of generation of rockers that have decided to make their move on this. So I think that's
they're all
part
from the
of the
1960s, it seems. Yeah. This like hippie generation. It's funny because Joni Mitchell, I knew more of her, and it's actually maybe embarrassing, maybe not embarrassing, but it's almost 100% because of the movie Love Actually.
Oh, Love from Both Sides now, and Love Actually featuring prominently. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I'm happy to dive into that well with you. It's one of my wife's favorite movies. We watch it every Christmas. It's all good.
Of course, every single Christmas. but yeah, so also Nils Lofgren, also I really had to look him up to be totally honest. But he was another artist. The three of them all basically, starting with Neil Young, he wrote this open letter, which he put on his website saying, you can have Spotify, you can have Joe Rogan, or you can have me, but you can't have us both. And that's that.
Now, am I right to say, I was seeing in some articles on this that he pulled that down, that you can't actually find that live, the Neil Young letter, as of right now?
The next day, actually.
Interesting aspects of all this.
Yeah. So it's strange because I wonder what was behind that decision. Who decided
tortious interference with contracts is a thing, folks. So we can certainly talk about that. That's a very hard kind of case to make, but generally speaking, we'll get into the specifics. You don't want to be in the business of telling two other parties that they shouldn't be contracting with each other. That can cause legal problems for you. So no legal advice. Obviously, we got the disclaimers at the front. We got other disclaimers here, but generally, it's a crime in a lot of areas to say, "Oh, don't contract with this other party that I have nothing to do with." The law doesn't like that.
Yes. Yeah. And that's why I think it's also interesting that I think Harry and Meghan, Prince Harry and Princess Meghan. All right. I don't know if they're still called Prince and Princess, but whatever.
I don't know. She's a duchess.
Those two.
Who knows? They're the lady from Suits and the guy from those Las Vegas videos from way back.
Oh, that's a good reference. Yeah. So they also have a big contract to podcast exclusively with Spotify. Theirs is worth, I think, 30 million. And their names have also been thrown around during this whole controversy as well, because, they made some kind of a statement saying that they were deeply concerned about these same sort of issues, but I think kind of left it at that a little bit vaguely. And I think maybe because they have their own exclusive contract and they don't want to put that at risk by coming out a little too strong about Joe Rogan. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It depends, right? So that's a really weird circumstance. One, and if you got fans in your comments, they can take offense at this as much as they like. In my opinion, Harry and Meghan tend to have opinions and comments to release publicly on virtually anything that touches them at all. So it's no surprise to see them jump into the fray on something like this. I have no idea what their relationship with Spotify is right now. I think they signed that contract years ago. I don't know whether they've produced anything for Spotify. So you've already got weird kind of relationships there in terms of expectations and workload and everything else. It also doesn't surprise me on a more beneficent reading to say, okay, if I'm associated with this brand, I sign an exclusivity deal. My brand is important. Obviously, the Duchess and her husband are all brand. I mean, like that's what they are, is maintaining that goodwill, that PR. And so if you do get associated in a way that you're uncomfortable with, that's the kind of thing that you jump in on. We're talking about corporate messaging. Harry and Meghan are a corporation. I mean, like that's, we should think about them the same way. And whenever you think about a corporation or another entity that has intellectual property that has value, you have to go and guard against it, right? A lot of people come in and say, well, why can't, on virtual legality, why can't Nintendo just allow this? And why can't these people do that? There are different sensitivities to these kinds of things, but you do have a concern when your name is associated with something that you think is potentially problematic or otherwise bad. So I see it both ways on Harry and Meghan, because they like to stick their noses in things, but also I can understand why, if it is of legitimate concern to them, this is the kind of thing that you do actually have a reason to stick your nose in. So I'm a lawyer. I answered that question both ways, but that's
why we do this.
That's how I really think about it. So
I'm
I'm not surprised.
Yes. Yeah. No, and that's a really good point there, is that, I mean, each of these individual sort of content creators in various ways, the musicians as well, you could say that they also are viewing this as, their own branding, and what are they associating themselves with, which, I mean, it's kind of funny because, like, Joni Mitchell and Neil Young and
So
Nils Lofgren, they're all hippie types, right? So, I
that's
mean, you think
true.
about, like, the counterculture from the 1960s. It's a little bit, it seems like things have sort of changed with that generation.
Well, it's weird, right? Because you got certain aspects of that generation and other generations. We don't need to give all the power or fault to just the 1960s rockers, but that there were certain groups and people that, down with the man, fight the power, rage against the machine, that kind of concept. And I mean, regardless of how you feel and where you think the truth lives on any of this stuff, which isn't really for me to say, the machine, the man, the power is in the trusted sources and the authoritative sources and the
Right.
folks that are telling you these specific things. So it's interesting that Joe Rogan, who sits outside that, who essentially brands that way, is saying, yeah, I want to talk to interesting people, but I'm also willing to talk to people that don't have that trusted sources stamp or the blue check mark or whatever, is essentially getting some of the kind of protests movement stuff against him, when, other than being popular and rich as a result, he's not the man.
Yeah.
He's not the World Health Organization or anything else. So it's an interesting kind of state of affairs. The other thing I'd be very interested in from a business perspective is, I mean, how much was this kind of protest really worth, right? What kind of money was Neil Young making from Spotify? It becomes a lot easier to protest, to make big declarative statements and do these kinds of things when you're already rich, you're old, and honestly, Spotify isn't driving your numbers. Versus, if we started to see big names that are clearly up at the top of those charts concerned with that from now, I think you have an interesting, more powerful story on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely, yeah. Although I think from what I had heard, Neil Young actually derives a not insignificant portion of his income from his music that's streamed through Spotify. So I think it was either a third, or maybe like 40% or something like that. Some number
No,
along
that is
those lines.
that's significant. Although again,
Yeah,
I'd want the nominal dollars there. I don't know what 40% is
true.
of what.
True.
So I
That's
mean,
a very good point.
and certainly there's been complaints about what Spotify pays people that contribute content to it anyway. Outside of Joe Rogan, he did all right. So I don't know. I would want more information there. I'm not trying to belittle them exactly, but
Yeah.
Neil Young, regardless of what percentage of his take he makes, probably isn't driving that Spotify question. In fact, when I saw the announcement go up, I said, "Oh, Rogan, that's the world's
Yeah.
easiest fiduciary decision."
Right.
So I mean, it's no surprise Spotify went that way. It was a little bit more of a surprise to me that you have kind of hangers on jump on. Again, devil's advocate. It's all legitimate. They're controlling their IP. Cynical Hoeg says, yeah, it's a big news story and your name hasn't been in the news for a decade. Throw on. Why not?
Yeah, that's true as well. That's an interesting point, that, to talk about the fiduciary role of Spotify, because Spotify is a publicly traded company, right? So people own stocks, so they have obligations to investors, of course.
So
To
let me make an important point right there, because people in my comments like to do this too. The board still has a fiduciary role, even if it's closely held. The public just means it's a bigger group of people. So you still have an obligation to your investors. If it's just
Yes,
you can screw over your obligation to yourself because no one's going to sue you over it. But there are a lot of close corporations, including in my book of business, people that I represent that have, 20, 30 investors. And we have to have the talk with those boards all the time about fiduciary obligations and say, no. One, no, you can't buy a boat for your lake house with this. And two, you have obligations to that guy
yeah,
over there that gave you money. He gave you
yeah,
money to do this thing, not that thing. And I know that, but
yeah,
it's something that I think people get really stuck on. Well, if it's not a public corporation, they can do anything. No,
yeah,
they can if they have total unanimity amongst their management and their ownership. But most companies don't get to a place where we would care about them in the news at that
yeah.
level without some kind of outside investment. That's all I
That
wanted
is
to
a
add.
That's a very good point. And I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because it's true. Anytime that you have somebody that is handling anyone else's money,
yep,
regardless of the amount, regardless of what proportion of the overall fund belongs to somebody else, anytime you have somebody that is handling any amount of someone else's money, they have fiduciary responsibilities to that person, or to that investment, or to, what have you. So we could be talking about, a family trust that's like 3 people.
Sure. And you see the lawsuits that come out of those when they go wrong.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, those I've seen a number of those, so, as soon as you have, one person, hey, Britney Spears is another example. You've got her dad handling her money. That's one person that he was responsible to. And now he's got potentially has some issues, coming from her and from her legal team. So, the story is still being written, but we'll see how that goes. But that's just one example, right? So Spotify does have a responsibility to its investors to make certain choices, right? As controversy arises.
Yeah, they have to evaluate, certainly.
Exactly. So number one, one thing that we can look at this is the fiduciary responsibility of Spotify to the investors over, the value of the relative contracts, right? Or the value of the relative IP. Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, these folks are their audiences tend to be a bit older. Spotify's overall audience tends to be much younger, and that audience tends to gravitate towards people like Joe Rogan. So, the actual audience of people that are on Spotify, that's something to take into account. Now, another thing to take into account is, when you start to have, as you said, that it was kind of surprising when you had multiple people kind of coming up and saying, yeah, me too, to join in with Neil Young, that then it starts to look like, well, is this now a wave of people that are starting to come up? And, and will there be more behind them, and will they have more star power, and will they be, geared towards a younger audience? Like, is this going to start a whole, movement potentially? So then that's another consideration that they would have to have in this sort of fiduciary role. And I think that, at least in my opinion, I don't know if you disagree, Rick, but in my opinion, I think that Spotify actually played a relatively good response to this whole sort of situation.
Oh, I mean, I think they did what was expected of them. The only other aspect I would add to your list of things that they're concerned about, which we also saw them respond to, is there are notions of employee mutinies that you're seeing with cultural items and other things where the employees and management can get into fights. So when you talk about fiduciary responsibilities, you also have the responsibility to try to keep the ship moving in the right direction and holding together. And so you saw Spotify also make comments to its employees about what it will and won't do in these kinds of contexts. So I think they did that well. I do think there's a certain bifurcation, whether on a political axis or not, with how people are looking at how these platforms operate. And Spotify, as part of this, basically adopted what I'd describe as the Twitter/YouTube approach. They published a series of rules about what content can be on their service. And we could talk about the specifics there as much or as little as you want. So I think it's good in terms of corporate behavior. It's what's expected, nothing to complain about from the investors. Whether or not what they did is an overall good to information flow, platform use, what we're seeing, the discussion of quote unquote misinformation. I have a video on virtual legality that talks about the fallacy of authoritative sources and talking about what YouTube was doing with elevating certain voices over others. Right. So I have philosophical issues with the concept of kind of putting your thumb on the scale of the battle of ideas as much as you see Spotify doing in response to this. But in terms of corporate law, lawyer, business answer, I think they did certainly what a tech company is expected to do, and nothing too terribly untoward. And like I said, as soon as Neil Young says it's me or Rogan, that's the easiest decision in the world.
Yes.
So it's not that Neil Young is a nobody. I saw that flash by in your comments. I'm not accusing him of being a nobody, but as Legalbytes has suggested, there is a certain difference in audience at Spotify. And frankly, the contracts, to the extent they exist for actual content contributors, because it's pretty simple. You get a little money out and that's it. It's a little bit like working on YouTube, I think. That is a different relationship from, we negotiated $100 million exclusivity contract. And we committed money to that. And that contract is going to have specifics about how we get out of it. And so to me, it was a very easy thing. Spotify was clearly getting some heat from certain quarters. So they had this series of statements from there. We can question. I think they also said they're going to add I think what you probably see, what is probably right below this video right now, depending on how fast YouTube is, which is a statement that says effectively, don't listen to these people. We've got a hub of people you should listen to. Click that link. Go visit YouTube's COVID hub. I'm sure it's great. But I get those warnings anytime I say it, regardless of whether I'm even talking about COVID. So I think Spotify is committed to having those, algorithmically generated things pop up anytime anybody says anything. And we could talk philosophically about whether that's a good thing or not. But to me, I'm of two minds. Corporate lawyer, sure, that all makes sense. YouTuber personality that does content and is dealing with all this stuff every day.
Yeah.
Little less enthused.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, no, I definitely, I'm with you on both of those. Let me get a few super chats and then we'll go in.
Super chats coming in. Look at
that. Yeah. And then we'll read the statement from Spotify CEO. It's not that long, so we can go through it. Edgar Allan Yo-Yo says second super chat. Thank you. In Fantasy I Die says crazy how similar the words demonization and demonetization sound. Also, Nick is the Joe Rogan of the Lawminal Order, my alternative to LawTube. Oh, that's good. Lawminal. Andy the Game Maker says shout out to Rogan's dog, Marshall, aka Marshmallow. I'm sure Indy would love to be friends with him. Mike the Dad Crosby, thank you so much for this generous super chat. He says a little for new shoes and a bit wider toe box. Grin. First live of yours I've caught. Thought I'd spread the love around and not just support Nick. Thank you. I do appreciate that. The Dragon's Treasure says after Joe Rogan literally murdered 10 billion minorities, I've decided to pull my loose leaf teas from Spotify. All right. Everybody get Dragon's Treasure tea and use the promo code Legalbytes for 5% off. So let's talk about this statement here.
All right.
I will share my screen. Doop. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So this is on Spotify's blog here. By Daniel Ek, that's the CEO. It says Spotify's platform rules and approach to COVID-19. And so we'll read this through and kind of stop and chat while we go along.
Sure.
So Rick, just stop me whenever you want. If you want to interject
see what I
anything.
Highlighted, because I do my research for these appearances. That's what I had on mind.
So I just wanted to highlight a few points here and there.
Sure.
A decade ago, we created Spotify to enable the work of creators around the world to be heard and enjoyed by listeners around the world. To our very core, we believe that listening is everything. Pick almost any issue and you will find people and opinions on either side of it. Personally, there are plenty of individuals and views on Spotify that I disagree with strongly. We know we have a critical role to play in supporting creator expression while balancing it with the safety of our users.
All right, so pause.
Okay.
So this is setting up what is the now traditional paradigm and talking about freedom of expression and these platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start out with a couple of things, right?
Okay.
In terms of philosophically, and I can only speak for me. That's why we're having a conversation with two people. But I'm a corporate attorney. I defend corporations and tell them how to treat their own terms of service. I will always stand by for the premise that the corporations can do what they like on these kinds of things. They built the platform, they expended the resources, they collected the money, but that doesn't mean that we can't critique what it is that they decide to do. So just to be clear, I do First Amendment stuff on my videos because we do talk about these kinds of things a lot. Government is controlled by the First Amendment, including the states, as incorporated by the 14th. Another video. But corporations can do what they want. doesn't mean that we have to stand by and be okay with when they decide to limit access to specific information. So when you see a sentence like this is why I paused here. We have a critical role to play in supporting creator expression. That sounds like a good place to stop the sentence. That they are a platform that provides these kinds of things. And yet, what you get is the same thing you get from Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere, while balancing it with the safety of our users. The safety of our users, as described in that sentence, requires a judgment from someone. And this balancing, this test, this premise requires judgment in a way that I think folks that get their information from these platforms should be at least a little bit concerned about. Because to the extent that the Spotify CEO says he disagrees with a lot of the information on a service, that's great. That's in fact what you want from a platform. You shouldn't be agreeing with everybody on your service. You're offering an open platform. But then in the very next section says, but we understand we have to balance these things. The next question should be, how are you going to balance it? What are you talking about? What are your rubrics? Can you qualify that in some fashion that I can actually judge you against? And that's where we're running into trouble with these platforms, because the answer is no. The answer is they take unilateral authority to decide these on their own. And what we're currently in is a paradigm that says very specific sources can be used for truth and everything else is misinformation. And I know that sounds too broad, but that's the kind of warnings that I get on my channel all the time. Regardless of whether I'm talking about something in my direct field of expertise or not, if it disagrees with something that was said on CNN one time or on Fox News, not playing favorites here, then YouTube can often come in and say, well, who are you? It's like, I don't know. I just have done these kinds of transactions for 15 years. And it doesn't matter because I'm just a guy. And I think there's a real concern there. So when I see that, my red flag goes up, because we're going down the same road, which is that Spotify is now going to take creator expression and balance it against an inchoate standard that is for quote unquote safety. And reasonable minds can differ, as I say, by my sweatshirt. Reasonable minds can differ as to what is safety, especially when talking about ideas and language. I've always been of the sticks and stones variety, but I know that that paradigm has shifted a little bit in generations behind me and as we look at 2022. But that kind of sentence, in my opinion, should concern you wherever you hear it, whether it's from a tech platform or not. I have said my piece. I apologize for saying it in 20 minutes.
No. This is, I mean, that's great. I'm glad that you're pointing out these red flags as they come up. Because I mean, it's of course, I mean, you can say that we want to balance things, but then what exactly does that mean? What, like when we get down to brass tacks, what is that going to look like? And for the most part, it's looked like, demonetizing videos because you've spoken certain buzzwords, right? Not even necessarily that you've said anything, evaluatively good or bad, or whatever, but it's just, you just happen to say those words. And so the algorithm detects it, and then it, just in case, demonetizes. So there's things like that. I also have several videos where, I talked about policies, COVID policies, specifically the Supreme Court decisions. I have videos like that I'm pretty sure, looking at the views, I'm pretty sure got shadow banned, because you look at the number of views in comparison to all of my other videos, and there's a lot of interest in these topics. So I don't know how those videos got so few views. I was very surprised.
And shadow ban might be too strong. You really should look at the official statements from YouTube on talking about COVID and things, because they are out there specifically saying we will depress the viewership and how our algorithm operates if you aren't in our trusted sources category. And I did a whole video on that because I find that philosophically offensive. We don't even have to talk about politics. This isn't Republicans, Democrats, anything else. It's just ideas. And YouTube has the right. I'll say it again. YouTube has the right to operate however they like. I have the right to tell them they're batshit insane when they do some of this stuff. So you get the swears over here. I'll try to keep it.
No. Let it fly. I don't care. So continuing on, in that role, it is important to me that we don't take on the position of being content censor, while also making sure that there are rules in place and consequences for those who violate them. So that, I mean, it sounds like, maybe things are a little bit less worrisome, maybe not.
Which is funny, right? He used wall again. And it's like, well, anything after the wall is what I just said, limit that a little bit. We want it. So what you see here from PR is we want it to be very clear that publicly we're in support of creator expression. We don't want to be content censor. And then you have the second half of our statements, which is what is that? You don't want to be a content censor, but also we have rules about censoring. Okay, I mean, it's fine. It's your platform, but I'm not going to give you full credit for creator expression and not censoring. Let's talk about what it is you want to do.
Right. And I do think that realistically in this situation, because of the sort of growing sort of blowback that was starting to pick up, I don't see a situation where Spotify would have just come out and said, you know what? No, we're not going to censor. End of sentence.
Did you see that? Just out of curiosity, did you see Substack over the last week? And they got into a bunch of trouble because a group called them out for having, I think, received revenue of $2.5 million from anti-COVID stuff or misinformation stuff. I pulled this up. I don't know if you saw it. I don't know if I can share. I don't.
Oh, yeah.
I've never used these fancy buttons. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Share.
I'll add it to the stream.
Yes. I don't know. Don't show these tips again. Sorry, we're just working through some technical issues that Hoeg always brings to the table.
I mean, it's StreamYard also doesn't it doesn't really do things very well to make adding to the stream very very smooth. There we go.
I did it. Okay, so it's January 26th. Substack has just received a ton of pressure. I don't know if the dates.
Before we go on, let me just say, for anybody that's listening and not watching, this is Rick just pulled up a tweet by Lulu Chang Maservi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So it's a whole Twitter thread. So we're gonna check this out.
Yeah, I apologize. Yes, I can do that better. I can not pretend we're only on video.
I always have to remind myself. So
yeah, no, absolutely. So Substack, for those who aren't familiar, is basically a paid writing platform. If you think of Spotify is listening, it's writers that go on and specifically get paid for their work, and you get specific subscriptions to them. And it's proven to be very lucrative for individuals that either didn't find their place at big places like New York Times, Washington Post, elsewhere. But as you can imagine, just like Spotify, when you allow any individual to put whatever they want on their platform, that can cause trouble for the platform on the whole. So Substack's getting a lot of pressure from the Washington Post that did an article about how much money they're making off of harmful COVID information. And they respond with this. At Substack, we don't make moderation decisions based on public pressure or PR considerations. An important principle for us is defending free expression, even for stuff we personally dislike or disagree with. We understand principles come at a cost. Wow. So it's Twitter. It's 280 characters, but you already don't see the kind of equivocation at the top, right? I'm proud of our decision to defend free expression, even when it's hard, because we want a thriving ecosystem full of fresh and diverse ideas. This is usually what I call in virtual legality, and it's not like I coined it, the battle of ideas. That can't happen without the freedom to experiment or even to be wrong. People already mistrust institutions, media, and each other. This is one of my favorite of the tweets. Knowing that dissenting views are being suppressed makes that mistrust worse, which is just so massively true. It almost goes without stating, but we need to state it more.
Yes.
Withstanding scrutiny makes truth stronger, not weaker. All battle of ideas. We made a promise to writers that this is a place that can pursue what they find meaningful without coddling or controlling. We promised we wouldn't come between them and their audiences, and we intend to keep our side of the agreement for every writer that keeps theirs. I respect that writers on Substack are people who like to think for themselves. They tend not to be conformists, and they have the confidence and strength of conviction not to be threatened by views that disagree with them or even discuss them. And this is becoming increasingly rare.
Yeah.
Who should be the arbiter of what's true and good and right? People should be allowed to decide for themselves, not have a tech executive decide for them. I wouldn't want someone to pick out my clothes for me, much less my ideas. The only area where we humans have a perfect track record is that we've consistently gotten things wrong. Every generation has beliefs and blind spots that make future generations aghast. It would be the height of arrogance to think we've suddenly become infallible now. If everyone who has ever been wrong about this pandemic were silenced, there would be no one left talking at all. And I'll stop it there. She continues on.
Oh my gosh.
But Substack comes out with the most full-throated battle of ideas endorsement that I have seen any of these companies do. And if you're cynical, I always try to tell both sides of the story. You could say, yeah, they just got told they got $2.5 million from spreading lies. And so you got a defense of them making money. But if you're not cynical, this is give or take what I believe about the exchange of information. And nobody's exactly ever going to match up with anything another human being believes entirely. But the concept that good ideas will win over bad, that transparency and sunlight is the best disinfectant to those crappy ideas, to evaluate them and shut them down, that when you talk about these things, you should be allowed to talk about them warts and all, because you can't figure out when something's a bad idea if somebody in the interim is telling you, no, don't pay attention to that, it's a bad idea. You don't get to evaluate for themselves, and then you've completely delegated critical thinking to another party. And that can work in spots, but it's putting a lot of pressure on those institutions. And I absolutely love that tweet, as I said when we were going through it just now, about if you hide things, it looks like it's for a reason, and it makes people distrust things more. So I'm not trying to take away from Spotify's response. Like I said, I think it's normal for tech. I don't think it's a bad response, and we're going to go through it. But when you see what you can have as a statement from one of these institutions, one of these platforms, I think it kind of highlights the problems that Spotify and Twitter and YouTube have when you can see they don't have that same full-throated declaration. And so I looked at this as a very big moment for these kinds of statements. We'll see if Substack holds to it. You know, it's always the proof is in the pudding as things go forward and they have more pressure put on them. But I love this. And I believe this individual is VP Comms. So she's in charge of making statements for Substack. And I thought it was a good one. So thank you for letting me figure out how to share the screen.
Oh, of course, of course. So I'll add this again, the statement from Spotify. But that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that, because that's I don't know how I didn't come across that, because that is so amazing.
In Twitter form. I don't know that they have an official release, which is more likely to get seen. So this was just one that I don't know if I'd bookmarked it or I'd flagged it, but I saw it happen. I go, ooh, they are putting their money where their mouth is right there.
Yeah. Oh, that is so refreshing to see that. And just amazing. I mean, I guess I had gotten so conditioned to social media platforms being like, well, we have to do something about the misinformation.
Yeah.
No, like I just, I was like, okay, I mean, this statement isn't so bad, considering all the things that we deal with. But then again, why should that be the standard? Like, why can't we have more of these platforms be like Substack to say, let's compare it to some Supreme Court justices. There's a reason why Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is the name of the namesake of my first pet. Holmes over there it's because of the marketplace of ideas. He said that the whole point in having free speech is to have a marketplace of ideas where you have them compete, and the best ideas will win out at the end. So you can't do that if you don't have something to compete against.
That's true.
So, but that's beautiful. So let's go back to this slightly more disappointing statement from
I ruined
Spotify.
Substack
no, but it's
ruined
good. Yeah, no, but in a beautiful way though. I'm happy you brought that up. So going to this next paragraph from the Spotify statement. You've had a lot of questions over the last few days about our platform policies and the lines we have drawn between what is acceptable and what is not. We have had rules in place for many years, but admittedly, we haven't been transparent around the policies that guide our content more broadly. This in turn led to questions around their application to serious issues, including COVID-19. So this is I highlighted that middle sentence because I wasn't exactly sure what they meant by we haven't been transparent around the policies that guide our content more broadly. Does that mean that they've just allowed more content out that they, otherwise think that they shouldn't, or the opposite?
My reading of that is that they haven't published these before. They were internal metrics that they were using to judge these things. that they might have had a overall policy that said, as we know from most tech platforms, don't offend us, but that you were otherwise at the mercy of who was reviewing your stuff, and it was unclear. Yeah. I take that primarily from the first bullet being here, we're publishing. That indicates to me that they weren't published in any place, which is always a bad idea. Yeah. But I think that's what's happening here. Transparent could mean something else, but that's what I would guess.
Okay.
And yeah, again, that's Spotify is a place that I don't know how many people interact with it directly. You can get on pretty easily. I mean, you can go find Virtual Legality right now, because I said
find Legalbytes there.
Yeah, great. And Legalbytes, fantastic. Because you set up an RSS and then you go figure out where you want it to appear. And Spotify was an obvious choice. And I'm not, the podcast doesn't make me money. So it's you sign up, and they got some terms of service that are essentially the same as a website, and you're done. So I don't know that there was ever kind of this broad, far-reaching platform rules concept. And, the tech companies always have the problem of wanting to be hip. So this is why you see, for instance, the Facebook policies in nested menus with like welcome messages and then a second summary and a margin, that they're trying to do different things because legalese is bad. And the thing I tell people is that legalese is bad. It's hard to read as prose, but it's designed to be descriptive and understandable on a kind of item by item basis. And when you take things down to simple English, whatever you want to describe it as, it can create more ambiguities, which is fine for the platforms because ambiguity helps them because they can do whatever they like. But it wouldn't surprise me if Spotify basically just had you'll abide by normal community rules, and if you don't, we'll do something against you. And then they said, that's not going to fly anymore. We better put something up. And then for the most part, they borrowed, I think it looks most like Twitter and YouTube's policies to me, as kind of a combo platter.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, so I think you're probably right about that. The fact that they're probably publishing their platform rules, which, I mean, I guess that's always better, right? At least for us to know what the standards are that we're being judged by.
Yeah.
I mean,
regardless.
That's one of the biggest criticisms. I think Twitch is probably the worst about that, right? Because they have like a secret strike guide. That's something that came out, over the last year because of Phantom Lord's lawsuit.
Yeah, they have a functional whitelist, right? I mean, they had all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
That don't apply the terms to these folks. I mean, it was like, well, all right.
Oh yeah.
That's interesting.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, but that's just one platform. I mean, they all seem to have some level of internal guidance that does not exactly doesn't exactly read in an intuitive way to the masses, right?
Granted.
Yeah. So let's read on. Based on the feedback over the last several weeks, it's become clear to me that we have an obligation to do more to provide balance and access to widely accepted information from the medical and scientific communities guiding us through this unprecedented time. These issues are incredibly complex. We've heard you, especially those from the medical and scientific communities, and are taking the following steps. So, and then they go through and they have 3 bullets here. Right. And they say, today we're publishing our longstanding platform rules. And then they go on. And then they say, we are working to add a content advisory to any podcast episode that includes a discussion about COVID-19. This advisory will direct listeners to our dedicated COVID-19 hub. And then the last bullet.
And wait, we got to read through the rest of that. Right. So it's their dedicated COVID-19 hub, a resource that provides easy access to data-driven facts, up-to-date information as shared by who? Scientists, physicians, academics, and public health authorities around the world, as well as links to trusted sources. So as long as you're the news or you're a scientist, physician, academic, and public health authority, you're all good. And probably all good regardless of whether you're talking about the subject in your specific area of expertise. As we've seen these things go, physicians can talk about policy folks can talk about physics or, the actual spread of viruses. As long as you're in this group, you get this weird authoritative stamp of approval, and it winds up in this particular fashion, regardless, by the way, of whether or not what you said last week is now not true this week, and what was said that was struck for misinformation would actually be true after the fact. There's no crying in YouTube or Spotify. There is only bands and answers.
And also there is, I'm glad you continued reading that sentence, because something that struck me is that the irony of this statement is that the thing that kind of sparked this whole thing was because Joe Rogan talked to a couple doctors that didn't agree with the overall narrative.
Physician, yeah. I mean, in that description of events, but not in their hub. No.
Right, of course. Of course. But I mean, but technically those two doctors fit into this group of people that are trusted, right? I mean, not necessarily as trusted sources according to, what's been determined by the powers that be, but they are in this group of, scientists, physicians, academics, and public health authorities around the world. They are, that is their profession. I mean, one of them was, he spent his work life working on mRNA vaccines, didn't he?
So I cannot pretend to have watched these interviews, unfortunately.
I didn't watch them either, and I should say that, but I haven't seen them. But that's my understanding is Dr. Malone was that he did a lot of work on this stuff, and this is what his, I don't think anybody disputes that at this point, at least as far as I've seen. If there's if anybody disagrees with that, let me know, comment below. But I think just a bit of irony here.
Yeah, and when we say we haven't watched it, I mean, to me, this discussion, the substance doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. When we're talking about just having an open expression of ideas, even Joe Rogan, I don't think would position himself, and I don't know whether they're going to look at his statement or not, as a source of these materials. He is giving a platform which people get concerned about to others that might disagree with the trusted sources and the COVID-19 hub. But he's essentially interviewing them and listening to them and potentially poking holes in what they have to say. He can be a pretty hard interviewer sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to just say, effectively, if you don't agree with the hub, you shouldn't have a voice at all. That's what that comes down to, is you have the potential of convincing somebody of something, and that can't be permitted. Where I look at that and say, wow, really? And especially when you look at the hub and you imagine how, if the hub just had a list of data points about the pandemic that the trusted sources had found, how much those would have shifted on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. It's just hard to say, why should this be the kind of thing that is banned or removed? And that's separate from Neil Young. Neil Young 1000% has the right to say, well, I'm not interested in being affiliated with an entity like that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, he never should have framed it as it's me or Rogan, because then you get into the tortious questions, which is why I think it got removed.
Yeah.
But he's absolutely allowed to say, take my stuff off. You guys are sick. And then I think everybody probably that's watching this video or listening to it could look at it and say, there have been institutions, corporations, other bodies that have made me sick, and I've decided not to buy their products or work with their services. That's totally normal. Yeah. But when you get into this kind of stuff, when you get into authoritative sources, I say, okay, that doesn't mean that the guy that Joe Rogan was talking to wasn't a quack. There are quacks in all industries, and it might be that was the case, but I can't evaluate that if I can't hear it, period. And so that's where this conversation actually lives.
Right. Exactly. Very good points. So the third thing that Spotify says that they are doing, the third step that they're taking, is we will also begin testing ways to highlight our platform rules and our creator and publisher tools to raise awareness around what's acceptable and help creators understand their accountability for the content they post on our platform. So basically, there's going to be a bunch of disclaimers when you upload your audio to Spotify.
Did you say the word COVID? You get the paragraph that pops up. It says, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to publish that?" Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So what is that going to look like? And helping creators understand their accountability. What will that look like in particular? What kind of warnings or who knows, right? But that all looks like that'll be on the content creator side. It won't be public to the listeners or viewers of these various podcasts and whatnot. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But it's the reason why I thought that this was kind of a measured response is because this is what every single platform has done without making a statement. Like it was just at the very beginning of the pandemic, YouTube just was like, oh, you're talking about COVID? Here you go. Boom, warning label. It was just from the very, very beginning. And so it's the fact that Spotify is just now at this point doing it and they're making a whole statement about it. It just seems like, okay, all right. So you're doing what everybody else is doing. It didn't seem like it was anything
Yeah, I don't think they
crazy.
went too far on this because I think Spotify, for the most part, is getting flack not because somebody on their platform is saying something. I believe it was their CEO, but it might have been somebody else high up that said, as part of all this, while they're doing damage control, that they've removed 20,000 podcasts for talking about COVID. And so this isn't an issue of national interest because it's a random on Spotify that's saying nonsense. It's because it's your main tentpole exclusive purchase that is the number one podcast that you share, that you spent money on making sure his audience comes to Spotify, and you are nested in with that particular brand more than these others. So Spotify, you want to give them credit, I think it's deserved, said, we're not going to address that. We're not actually going to talk about this like it isn't just a random. This is effectively what you would respond to normally with like the article that says, well, effectively what they said with Substack, which is like, there's a bunch of people making money and potentially contributing to the success of this platform with nonsense. And this is what that would look like as a Spotify response. The actual pressure here is that Spotify is deflecting, which is you entered into an agreement with this guy that we consider to be persona non grata, and we have all these people that have an issue with. You're not answering for that. And Spotify hasn't, as far as I can tell, in any of their statements. So I think they do deserve credit for not capitulating there. Again, cynical. You could say the same thing that I just said about Substack, which is, well, this is where their money lives. However you feel about that exclusive contract, it appears to be working very well for Spotify in terms of driving people to their platform. So corporations always a lot harder to get to move against things that are very lucrative for them. There's no question about that.
Yes. Even though there apparently is a moveon.org petition that people can sign if they want to try to remove the Joe Rogan podcast from Spotify. So I mean, it's the pressure, I guess, is still there. I don't know if it's actually going to amount to anything because of course. Yeah, it's not likely to go away so long as Spotify keeps him up there. There are people that are just they won't be satisfied with anything until he's gone and effectively canceled forever.
Well, the thing about it is, the weird part about this argument, right, is when you have 100 million subscribers, you average 11 million views for your episode, you get kicked off of Spotify, you're not actually going to be canceled. you're just going to move on to joerogan.com or whatever and continue doing what you're doing. So it's a little bit of a kind of Pyrrhic concept. When you try to cancel someone, and whether or not that's legitimate or not, I don't want to get into a debate about cancel culture necessarily, is you have to pick a target that can't just go and say, all right, well, we'll do it over here then. And true. Joe Rogan is 1000% the target that you don't hit because it's a podcast. You could build it on freaking SoundCloud in 2 seconds. So it's not the kind of thing that Joe Rogan is going to disappear on, even if Spotify were to kick him off. And
so true.
Depending on what's in that contract, Joe could just take whatever's left of the $100 million, get that, and then still make a competitive podcast. So, I mean, that's also what Spotify's evaluating.
And that's another element to this whole conversation is, I mean, obviously none of us know, other than the $100 million valuation of it, none of us know what any of those terms say. So, if it says, if one party decides to, try to back out of this contract within a certain amount of time or, within any time, I mean, obviously it's likely to end at some point. Right. But, if let's say it's, at some point that's determined to be premature, there could be some heavy duty fees involved with that, or penalties, I should say.
Yeah, and what we do know is that Joe Rogan was already controversial when he was entering into the agreement with Spotify. So both Spotify's counsel and his counsel would have known that was an area of sensitivity as they negotiating this. This is very unlikely to be an area of the contract that isn't covered, where you really get into ambiguities and fights. This is very much going to be something that says, here is what we're concerned about. Here's what's allowed. Here's what we're not going to interfere with. Here's how you're going to be allowed. Here's what cause actually means. Cause meaning we can terminate this contract without paying you the rest of it. And chances are Spotify knows that none of this, interviewing someone else, is not cause. I don't know what he said, but if he's not advocating positions, he's interviewing someone, chances are that's already covered within how the contract treats what he was going to do and how he was going to operate. So when Spotify is evaluating this, we're speculating, of course we are, but I would be far more willing to believe that Spotify would be the one that would be in serious financial trouble for just walking away based on the facts as presented right now.
So true. And that's such a good point is to note that, when two parties are entering into an agreement, you have to, let's say there's later a breach of that contract by one of the parties. You have to look at certain things that would have been foreseeable. Now, would it have been foreseeable at the time of contracting that Joe Rogan would be considered a controversial character and that he would be having some controversial conversations? Hell yes, of course, because he that's a very good point. He already had his fair share of controversies leading up to this contract. So Spotify could never, ever, ever argue, oh, well, you made a radical 180 and all of a sudden
you went crazy.
You've gone crazy.
No, you know what you got.
Exactly. They knew exactly what they were getting into when they signed him on. And that was one of the things that was so great about him, is because of the fact that there is this controversy. Controversy drives interest, drives clicks, drives listeners. So, it's they do benefit from that controversy as well. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyhow, let's finish this this statement, and then we'll get to Joe Rogan's response, because he had a video that he uploaded to Instagram. So back to this Spotify statement. It says, "I want you to know that from the very first days of the pandemic, Spotify has been biased towards action." I don't know exactly what that means.
Such a weird phrasing. You want to talk about corporate messaging, biased towards action. That's right out of the Harvard Business School.
I don't, as a viewer or a listener, I don't really know what that means, but okay, let's move on.
We're interested in doing things. Are they the right thing? Doesn't matter. We're doing things.
Right, exactly. We launched a variety of educational resources and campaigns to raise awareness, and we developed and promoted a global COVID-19 information hub. Oh, okay, that's what they meant.
We discussed that. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, they have some donations to talk about now, so
yes.
buckle up.
We donated ad inventory to various organizations for vaccine awareness, funds to the World Health Organization and COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access, or COVAX, to increase vaccine equity, and supported the Go Give One fundraising campaign. And we established a music relief project to support the creative community. While this is not a complete list, I hope it gives you a sense of how seriously we've approached the pandemic as a company. Hey, look at all these great things that we did.
Yes. We're biased towards action. We created an information hub that we're now going to use to likely suppress people that aren't in the hub. And we gave money to things like the World Health Organization, which are undoubtedly in the hub. So it kind of circles around itself in terms of information control. But I don't have any problem with any of this. Like I said, corporations can do what they like. I don't think it gets you very far. It's one of those interesting paragraphs that I think is more about Spotify than it is about communicating. One of the things I like to say on my channel is that you should always be evaluating these messages for what they are seeking to achieve with the reader or the listener. And usually you can suss that out. This one looks to me like it's just a little bit self-aggrandizing, more than trying to convince that people that Spotify has been doing anything. But if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt, it's designed to say, just so we're clear, if you're thinking about saying, well, it's about time you did anything about COVID, no, we've been doing things since the beginning. But I don't really think it reads that way.
Yeah. So then it goes on, I trust our policies, the research and expertise that inform their development, and our aspiration to apply them in a way that allows for broad debate and discussion within the lines. We take this seriously and will continue to partner with experts and invest heavily in our platform functionality and product capabilities for the benefit of creators and listeners alike. That doesn't mean that we always get it right, but we are committed to learning, growing, and evolving. Daniel. So, yeah, I mean, if it's just a matter of they're going to put a warning label on it, like the warning labels that we see someone in the chat earlier mentioned it was like the California, prop,
Everything
whatever,
causes
cancer
cancer.
warnings.
Oh, I
Yes.
love those when I'm in California.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
the lamps, this lamp causes cancer, everything
This
everywhere.
room, the sun, the ground, everything causes cancer. So, be warned.
Yeah.
California causes cancer is basically what
Yeah,
it's
go visit
saying.
California. This is not an overstatement. You're literally going to be checking into your hotel. Person's going to have a little sign next to them, and it's going to say everything causes cancer.
And it's because they have to, because of California Prop whatever that was passed however many years ago, saying that it was a requirement that in anything that has known carcinogens requires a cancer label. So so now unfortunately it's you see that a lot of things might cause cancer. And it's pretty much everything that we interact with, really.
Living causes dying. News at 11.
True, true, true. Yeah. So, in the same way, we've got these COVID labels on pretty much everything, everywhere you go on every single platform. So, how much is that really going to be, um, you know, censoring speech? I don't know. I'm a little bit optimistic,
Sure.
personally, because it seems like this statement is trying to more assuage the people that are crying foul about Joe Rogan, while at the same time they are, holding on to Joe Rogan because he's got the numbers, right?
Oh, he's enormously valuable to them. And I think it's clear that they don't want to do anything. I mean, if you look through those links to actually look at what they've put forth as their standards, the ones that they're publishing now, they do what we see the tech platforms do, which is they have a lot of mays and cans and other words that give them broad authority to decide whether something's going to be a problem or not. At a broad scope philosophical level, that's an issue for me because they essentially decide who the winners and losers are and when something's going to be an issue or not. And it's not going to be an issue for Joe Rogan when, if you had the exact same interview with your 50 subscribers, it might well be an issue for you.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how these things operate. But even there, I think you can look at the platform description and see a kind of milquetoast description of things that they've got a problem with, things that people really don't say. The things they call out: don't encourage the consumption of bleach products. Okay. You can't promote or suggest that the vaccines are designed to cause death. Okay. All right. That's a very specific kind of statement that you would make.
Yeah.
Assert that COVID or other medical diseases aren't real. Okay. I don't watch Joe Rogan or listen to him, but I assume he's not making these kinds of statements. These are the very far out things here. It's not talking about efficacy or balancing rights or things like that. It's like, okay. And that's really all Spotify was willing to commit to. They include what we expect them to include, which is this list is non-inclusive. We'll decide later if you said something bad. Okay, fine, tech platform. But the things that they actually decided to highlight are, quite extreme and specific. So I think Spotify is indicating, as much as I would prefer a Substack kind of statement, that Spotify really doesn't want to be in the business of removing things. They make their money from not removing things. They'd prefer not to, but it is a kind of assuaging action. So I do think if we were to put these in some kind of the tier maker where you got S's and F's, Substack's an S, Spotify's probably pretty high, but the concern that I have is that that's basically on a curve because so many of the other ones are so darn low.
So true.
So
That's true.
I don't have an issue with this. I don't have an issue with their response. I just want everybody to answer like Substack.
That's a very valid point. I mean, and now Substack has been, so far, knock on wood, they've been a good example of what we could have, right?
Oh, they're going to get more crap for that. I mean, we're really going to find something out about Substack. That statement that I posted here that we talked about, and I sent you the link so you can put it in the video if people are interested.
Oh, yeah.
But that was only a few days ago. So the Washington Post put out their takedown of Substack. I would expect more of that because the other aspect of this, again, cynical business-minded folks, is that those folks that do buy ink by the barrel are threatened by Substack. I mean, it's essentially an individualized loss of authority for them, not conspiracy minded. I'm not talking about, military industrial complex, that kind of thing. It's just literally journalists leaving newspapers, going to do their own thing, and then essentially collecting money that those newspapers think was rightly theirs. So expect more of the Washington Post article about how evil Substack is, because that's what they're fighting against as those specific authorities start to dwindle, both in importance and revenue. So this will be an existential fight for them. And it'll be interesting. I've seen enough to know you don't always stand by your guns when you make statements like that. And if you see them pivot, I'll be sad. But as long as they hold to it, that I think is a fantastic full-throated endorsement of what I'd like to see all these platforms say.
Oh man. So I'm putting the link to the tweet in the chat, and I'll put it in the description below as well once I have a chance. But that's a very good point. I mean, I hadn't really spent, I mean, I've seen people link to Substack on Twitter and elsewhere, but I had never really gone onto that platform. So I didn't realize that it's been characterized in this way as like, journalists leaving these big, journalism institutions to basically go and work for themselves and kind of do what we do, but for journalism, it sounds like. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Yes, no, exactly. It's exactly that. See if I can did that button again correctly. Yes.
Okay.
So this was what kind of started it, from the old Center for Countering Digital Hate, which I'd never heard of, but this was them showing that Substack was making a whole bunch of money off of what they describe as anti-vax misinformation. And they have a number of examples which really are misinformation. So, take it with a grain of salt. But this is 5 days ago. Washington Post has already gone live with this. I would expect more of that to happen. That's what Substack's responding to. And it'll be interesting. But it does have that. It's even more antagonistic than what we usually see, right? YouTube is technically a competitor to mainstream media or newspapers or what have you, just because people can put stuff up there. This is much more direct. These individuals here, I think, what is it? Former New York Times writer, other folks like that have gone on to make money on Substack, and apparently there is an audience there that's putting some substantial amount of revenue through. I'm with you. I haven't spent any money buying anything from Substack, but it's effectively, a more directed Patreon or whatever else might be your preferred crowdfunding source for writers and professional ones a lot of the time. So people are making money off of newsletters, things like that. And this threatens the Washington Post. And I give quotes to the Washington Post. I talk to folks over there, and I think there's a lot of well-meaning people. But as an institution, it threatens the existence of that kind of thing. And so you will see more of this.
Interesting.
And it'll be interesting to see
send me the link to this page too, so that I'll put it in the description as well, in case anybody wants to take a look at it. But I mean, it's funny because it's like, listening to you describe it in this way, it makes me think of, Uber and taxis, right?
Sure.
It's just a disruption of the industry, it sounds like. And so, you had taxi companies, or taxi, I guess big companies or I don't know if there were any unions, but like big groups of taxi people that were like, hey, Uber's not a good thing, Lyft is not a good thing. They're destroying our whole industry, and same thing with Airbnb. Hotels were getting involved with trying to destroy Airbnb as it grew and started to disrupt that whole industry. And and it just sounds like the same thing, but in journalism.
Yeah. And look, some of this is things that Substack needs to be aware of, et cetera, et cetera. And, taxi drivers, to be honest, I felt for taxi drivers when that transition happened, because I don't know how much people know about taxis, but when we talk about taxi medallions, those are essentially certificates of need for taxi drivers, and they went up and up and up in value, required a tremendous amount of investment to actually go acquire, because these cities were keeping that number down. And then when you democratized driving services, the last people holding the super expensive medallions got absolutely killed. And so and that's a regulation thing, right? I mean, you're always and everywhere you can find intervening forces that result in these kinds of situations. But I do feel for them. You don't want to be the last buggy whip manufacturer when Ford comes to town. I get it. But unfortunately, someone often is. And so when this kind of thing happens, I'm just telling folks to expect more Substack articles in the next little while. because if they think they can find purchase with this kind of argument, they're going to go for it because Substack represents that existential threat.
Yeah. So let me get a few more super chats, and then we'll get on to Joe Rogan's response, because it was a very, very even-handed sort of response. Aaron Catron says, I would rather listen to Neil Young on vinyl than anything on Spotify. I'm a perpetual late adopter of tech, but I also don't care for the direction Neil is going here. That's totally fair. Let's see here. Then Christian Rennie says, are any of you following Fowler versus Ohio State 2016, fired because of being quote unquote white? Recently, judge has ruled there's enough evidentiary support for a jury trial. This seems very controversial. I had not heard about this. Had you?
Yeah, no, I don't. As a rule, I don't follow Ohio State things as a Michigan Wolverine. But no, no, I haven't heard of it. It might not be as controversial as you think. I mean, there are, in general, discrimination on the basis of race is illegal. Without commentary on which race that is. So it might not be, but it might also find news articles. I have given up trying to predict what people will be outraged about or will find interest in, but I have not been following the case specifically myself.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. I hadn't heard about it either, but I wrote it down. I'll see if I can check it out and maybe make a video about it, or, maybe talk about it. Who knows? So, Aaron Catron also says, I always wondered why my college professors would make us skip certain sections of reading. One professor would skip things in Aristotle that contradicted his bad interpretation of Plato. He wasn't happy when we called him on it. No, that's an interesting point. That's a very fair point. So, it reminds me of Justice Antonin Scalia, how he said that, the reason why he thought that legislative history was a terrible idea for the Supreme Court, for any court to draw for, interpretation as to legislative intent, for any kind of a statute, was that he was like, if you look at legislative history, all you're doing is just picking the voices that you like in the room, because everybody, people are debating both sides about, how this statute is going to end up. And by the way, this is not how the statute actually ended up. So how can you say that the voices that you're picking out are actually legitimate?
Right. So. No, and I've when I do cover things like Supreme Court decisions, and we talk about, the Gorsuch civil rights case and things like that, one of the things I talk about a lot is a general proclivity on my judicial philosophy to read these things as programming language, to look at what the actual impact is as it's written, as it was finished, as I think Gorsuch does in that case. And that was, that case in the decision making was upsetting to seemingly everybody in all sides of the political spectrum, depending on how you read the thing. And I said that exactly. The author should be dead for the most part. And I fully admit, when I'm having arguments on Twitter or otherwise discussing these things, I'm pretty regularly using the Federalist Papers to talk about constitutional organization, but that's mostly to describe what people are seeing, not for the truth of the matter asserted, but how there can be concepts for why, the judiciary is separate from the legislature, why there's an electoral college, those kinds of things, rather than actual legal determination. So I tend to agree with that suggestion that you should read it. You should read the statute as what it is, rather than trying to guess at what other people thought it was. And it also prevents you from giving specific individuals from the past power over what a normal person would read it at in the present, without getting into living document concepts. I think that's how you have to read language. Right.
Agreed. Totally agree. Andy the Game Maker says Dr. Malone created several of the patents used for the mRNA vaccines.
So, yes. And to be clear, when I suggested, hey, I don't know if he's a quack, I don't know if he's a genius, I didn't watch the interview. It can go either direction, but you can't evaluate someone without actually listening to them. That's my point.
Right. And that's why, having a policy for openness is probably the best thing for, at least, you and I agree on that. Not everybody agrees on that.
Not everybody agrees on that.
And to quote a good friend of mine, reasonable minds can differ.
Yes. Yes, they can.
Christian Rennie says, is there a precedent for suing Farm for the vax? People listened to government and got it, and then a person died from adverse reaction. Since this vax is experimental and rushed. So
you just got demonetized for reading that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it already was. I'll have to go through the manual review process anyhow, within probably 2 minutes of this stream. But this, so there is something, and even before the COVID vaccine, there has been for a long time now a vaccine fund for people that end up having some kind of an adverse reaction, and it results in some sort of permanent damage to them, because this is something that happens, right? Like, you don't really hear about this very often, but this is something that does happen, and there is a fund. I've talked about this before on the channel, but I did work on a conservatorship case once where there was a young woman who, as a girl, had received a vaccine, had an adverse reaction, and had to be under a conservatorship later on as a result. And so, questions about her care, questions about her finances, all this kind of stuff resulted. But one of the big things that was funding it was the vaccine fund.
Okay.
So that's something that does exist.
Well, and my understanding was the emergency status changed some of the liabilities there. I can't pretend to be a vaccine liability, personal injury guy, but I think there's stuff that you'd have to evaluate there. In my mind, the avenue for liability has always been the businesses that force you to get the vaccine. That's the one where it's like, well, that's a secondary consideration. If something bad happens there, I wouldn't want to be counsel for those companies. And that's, I think, more likely than all of the things being equal. If it's the government or somebody that has a close relationship with the government, assume that some kind of immunity is going to get in the way. It can be a problem in a lot of instances. If you got a private body in the period between when you're dealing directly with the government, you might have a liability case. But that's back of the envelope stuff. I can't pretend to be an expert.
Yes. Yeah. And to clarify, I think that one of the reasons for starting that fund, that settlement fund, was to prevent enormous civil lawsuits from happening. So instead of filing a lawsuit against the government or against the pharmacies or pharmaceutical companies, I should say, you instead apply to this specific program, and if you qualify, then you get funds for it. So that's, right along with what you said, Rick. It's a close relationship that was sort of developed to prevent this kind of liability, which is it's something that has happened in various contexts, right? Like there was a 9/11 fund for the same reason, because the lawsuits that would have resulted from it would have been enormous and could have had disastrous effects on our economy. So, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a while for various different subjects and different reasons. So that's that one. Gustoman001 says, why are we pretending that quote unquote misinformation somehow trumps freedom of speech? We should be laughing at this word like all the other gaslighting terms. So, just to clarify, we are, of course, talking about private corporations. We are not talking about government entities, although there is a possibility, who knows, that they have some sort of a connection. There were the Facebook emails with Zuckerberg and Fauci that came out months ago, of course, that seemed to hint at some sort of a very strong backdoor connection between the two. So that's always possible. But, beyond those emails, there hasn't been any sort of link that really the masses can prove. So, to say that they are somehow state agents, there's just not enough evidence to prove that. So, we're talking about some private corporations that have the ability to censor speech in a way that governments can't because of the First Amendment. But the First Amendment really only applies to the government and to certain state actors that are acting, within the direction and control of the government, essentially. So anything you want to add to that, Rick?
No, I think you nailed it. State actor doctrine is really, really hard to prove and a very high burden. And I know the internet likes to talk about it. And I think with some legitimacy as we see these corporations operate. But in my view, we're still well away from actually being able to make a case that these guys are actually acting on the auspices of being the government.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So Quicks DC 614 says, Hoeg, discrimination is quote unquote discrimination is illegal.
True.
Also, Hoeg, quote unquote, unless you're a Buckeye. LOL,
yeah, I just
JK,
don't concern myself with Buckeyes. You're at your own leisure. No, I'm joking. But yeah, no, it's Michigan. Go Blue.
There you go. There you go. So now we're going to turn to the, here we go. Joe Rogan. He released a video, and we won't go through the whole thing because it's like almost 10 minutes long.
Oh my.
But I mean, I'll just start playing it, and let me know if you want to stop and chat for about any of this. So we'll see how long we get into it before we want to discuss it. All right, let me know. Oh, by the way, let me know if you can hear it.
Hello, friend.
Could you hear that?
I could. I think it was just loading up, so it didn't match up yet, but it might have in another second.
Okay. Well, let me try it again. I'll play it for like a full 5 seconds, and
sure.
Let me know if you can't hear it.
Hello, friends. I wanted to make a video to address some of the controversy that's been going on over the past few days. And first of all, to say thank you to everyone that sent love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And it's been very nice to hear from you. I wanted to make this video, first of all, because I think there's a lot of people that have a distorted perception of what I do, maybe based on sound bites or based on headlines of articles that are disparaging. The podcast has been accused of spreading dangerous misinformation, specifically about 2 episodes, a little bit about some other ones, but specifically about 2. One with Dr. Peter McCullough and one with Dr. Robert Malone. Dr. Peter McCullough is a cardiologist, and he is the most published physician in his field in history. Dr. Robert Malone owns 9 patents on the creation of mRNA vaccine technology and is at least partially responsible for the creation of the technology that led to mRNA vaccines. Both these people are very highly credentialed, very intelligent, very accomplished people, and they have an opinion that's different from the mainstream narrative. I wanted to hear what their opinion is. I had them on, and because of that, those episodes in particular, those episodes were labeled as being dangerous. They had dangerous misinformation in them. The problem I have with the term misinformation, especially today, is that many of the things that we thought of as misinformation just a short while ago are now accepted as fact. Like, for instance, 8 months ago, if you said, if you get vaccinated, you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID, you would be removed from social media. They would ban you from certain platforms. Now that's accepted as fact. If you said, I don't think cloth masks work, you would be banned from social media. Now that's openly and repeatedly stated on CNN. If you said, I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab, you'd be banned from many social media platforms. Now that's on the cover of Newsweek. All of those theories that at one point in time were banned were openly discussed.
What's that?
I'd have to go look, but I think the suggesting the origin of COVID came from a lab is one of the itemized things that YouTube says is a no-go, or at least it was.
I think that it's gone from being what was it, like a conspiracy theory that was soundly rejected by all scientists to a fringe theory to possibility or something. I've seen some examples of the actual headlines that have changed on the same articles about the same topic.
What's funny about that is that, Rogan's right. He goes a little far, because it wasn't even that you needed to make statements that said anything about masks or anything about efficacy or anything about these kinds of things. There was a point in time where almost all my videos on this topic got demonetized because I refused to use magic words to talk about COVID. And that's how the algorithm finds you. And it was just talking about, as you said, possibility. It was, well, historically, we haven't seen masks have a lot of luck against respiratory illnesses. If they're not really designed that way. And having that conversation would get you the bullet to the head just as soon as you said it. And it's absolutely fascinating, because that is what he's saying right now is accurate, in that it changes so fast that there really should never have been any action against those folks that just say, we shouldn't close our minds to possibilities here. And folks can argue, well, that's leading to bad thoughts and all these various things. But as somebody that likes to critically read, that likes to critically consider, I don't think there's any question from 2020 on that there were a lot of decisions that were being made where you could say, okay, well, is that policy really taking into account X, Y, or Z? Is this actually serving to promote health when you lock people down and take kids out of schools? Those kinds of things are worthy of public consideration. Reasonable minds can differ. And I don't mind somebody that disagrees with me and says, yes, it's worth it to do X, Y, or Z, or it's not. But if you don't have the conversation and you just say you have to bow to the World Health Organization or the National Institutes of Health or whomever it is that you have to bow to, that's how you get bad policies. And I would say that the last 2 years have been strong evidence of bad policies and technocratic control leading to places we don't want to go.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think this is why, you know, we were kind of chatting about this over DMs yesterday, but you know, I might be the last person in LawTube who has yet to get even.
We were joking about that.
You know, even a what is it? A warning, you know, a strike warning, because everybody else has gotten at least a warning, if not a first strike, because of just talking about policies, right? I mean, because we as lawyers, we're used to sort of looking at multiple perspectives on a certain issue, different arguments, one side versus the other, and kind of trying to poke holes into it to see like, well, does this really stand up? Because that's what we do as lawyers.
Yes.
And the same thing is true in science, right? Because that's how you end up with scientific consensus. Is you have a bunch of scientists that say, okay, here's my paper on X theory. Please, peers, review this. Tell me what you think. Where are the holes in this? How can I, you know, what are the vulnerabilities that I need to take into account to make this better so that this theory holds up? And that's how you end up at scientific consensus. It's not by drowning out other voices that disagree. It's by doing exactly, you know, what we do as lawyers with legal arguments about policies. It's the same damn thing. But I mean, right, exactly. The yes, all of this.
No, you nailed it.
All the stuff.
Yeah, call it. You got it. No, I agree completely. That's one of those things. I'm from a family of lawyers on the one half, but scientists on the other. You know, my grandfather had several dozen patents. That's what he was about, and he would talk about science as a process that you hypothesize and then you prove them wrong. And that's why when I see, you know, the statements, I am science, the representative of science, and that kind of thing, that's how those things rub me the wrong way. It's always a process. And when you lose that, you lose the ability to discern reality and truth out of all these things. And I don't mind people saying, well, they changed their minds because they got more data. That's fine. Absolutely. Right. But then you need to understand, you need to reflect on how you treated people that said data's not strong enough. We should consider the possibility of X, Y, and Z, because they were right. They were right to say, okay, data's not there. This is essentially like when you get reports early on from a riot or something where you're getting all these weird conflicting things, and there's a Reddit thread that's trying to discern who the murderers are, and all this stuff is happening. It took a year and a half, but it's all happening at once. And you should be pausing and saying, well, none of this is going to be quite right. And if you're evaluating public policy, you say, oh, you guys should try to avoid making harsh pronouncements because we don't know enough for harsh pronouncements. And you say any of that, and it was going against trusted sources. It was going against authoritative figures. It was going against all this stuff. And I don't blame people for being worried and wanting to look for folks with more information, more credentials and things like that. But when you have Joe Rogan, who gets all this crap, saying this kind of stuff for only the first 2 minutes of his statement, and I listen to him as someone that doesn't listen to Joe Rogan and say, basically all that's right. Like I said, I think some of the statements he used actually were a little further than he needed to go to prove his point. But basically all that's right. I start to look at it and say, well, what is this fight about? Because what he just described is talking to people that are credentialed and authoritative in their own ways, and they disagree with something important that's on the hub. How can we not listen to that? And maybe I come away from that interview and say, that guy's an idiot. Or, you know, hey, I developed patents for mRNA vaccines doesn't mean I'm actually an expert on what public policy should be right now. Evaluate it thusly and have that conversation. Presumably that's what he's doing. I can't imagine a world in which you can't say we should listen, evaluate, and judge for ourselves.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And you're right. That's a very valid point. That, I mean, even just asking the questions was enough to get people into trouble on social media platforms. Just questioning, hey, maybe we should consider X, Y, and Z. Are we sure about this? And this is something that I also was thinking about, is that, before the pandemic, it was so common to have so many, like when somebody got a cold or the flu or something, people would have a home remedy that they would turn to, or like, something that would be passed down from like their mom or their grandma or something, like, oh, and maybe it was an old wives' tale, but like, everybody at least had those in mind. And so it's perfectly understandable, to me anyway. Let me know if you think otherwise, but it seems perfectly understandable for people to continue along those lines with all kinds of different, things that they come across, whether it's the cold or the flu or COVID, to try to find something that works for them individually to help with remedies, like it's
simpler. Than going through the whole process and doing these various kinds of things. That's a whole nother video on healthcare and the issues just in terms of availability here in the United States, but especially. But no, I agree. One of the really interesting things is, because of the way this played out, whether you want to blame Trump or not, that's up to you, is actually discussing treatments, actually discussing, hey, so you got COVID, Captain America gif, is essentially verboten. There was a period of time that I think is faded now that everybody's getting Omicron. There was a period of time where it was essentially, it was a scarlet letter. Oh, you got it. That must mean you didn't vaccinate, or you didn't mask, or you didn't do any of these other kind of things. And so we're not going to talk about how to treat you.
Right.
And that's insanity. And it's a respiratory illness. And, I think basically everybody's getting Omicron at this point in time. And that's not great, but it is what it is. You need to start talking about what treatments look like and having those kinds of conversations. And that was essentially disallowed when the vaccines came out and all this stuff happened with respect to vaccination and changing definitions of what anti-vaccines are and all these kinds of things. And it's remarkable to me. I've never lived in a period in my life that this kind of stuff has happened. I honestly thought it was impossible to happen in a certain fundamental way, in the United States especially. And it's been greatly distressing as someone that likes to critically think and evaluate these things, to see essentially the shutdown of all other information sources, because that's how we learn and grow, whether it's by learning something new or by challenging what you were just told because it's wrong. That's how you critically think. That's how human beings are designed to think and work. And it's no good to me to see these kinds of things. And then to see in other contexts, you see, various people on institutional media talking about Joe Rogan and his audience is stupid, and that's why it's dangerous, and things like that. And we just get into very dangerous areas with othering the humanity of folks that disagree with us on policy issues.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. So let's continue on this, because
get back to Joe.
Speaking of learning and growing, he talks a bit about that. So let's continue.
Discussed by those two men that I had on my podcast that have been accused of dangerous misinformation. I do not know if they're right. I don't know, because I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist.
He says
I'm just a person who sits down and talks to people and has conversations with them. Do I get things wrong? Absolutely. I get things wrong, but I try to correct them. Whenever I get something wrong, I try to correct it, because I'm interested in telling the truth. I'm interested in finding out what the truth is. And I'm interested in having interesting conversations with people that have differing opinions. I'm not interested in only talking to people that have one perspective. That's one of the reasons why I had Sanjay Gupta on, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who I respect very much. And I really enjoyed our conversation together. He has a different opinion than those men do. I had Dr. Michael Osterholm on at the very beginning of the pandemic. He is on President Biden's COVID-19 advisory board. I had Dr. Peter Hotez on, who is a vaccine expert. I'm interested in finding out what is correct, and I'm also finding out how people come to these conclusions and what the facts are. Now, because of this controversy, and I'm sure there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes with these controversies, but Neil Young has removed his music from the platform of Spotify, and Joni Mitchell, and apparently some other people want to as well. I'm very sorry that they feel that way. I most certainly don't want that. I'm a Neil Young fan. I've always been a Neil Young fan. I'll tell you a story at the end of this about that. One of the things that Spotify wants to do that I agree with is that at the beginning of these controversial podcasts, like specifically ones about COVID, is to put a disclaimer and say that you should speak with your physician and that these people and the opinions that they express are contrary to the opinions of the consensus of experts, which I think is very important. Sure, have that on there. I'm very happy with that. Also, I think...
So here we get again into the questions of what Spotify should be doing. And it's obviously up to Joe and his show, and he's got interactions with them. And he's undoubtedly had calls and Zoom meetings or whatever with the folks at Spotify. You don't have $100 million asset that you don't confer with on these kinds of things. So he's already had that conversation. I would be willing to bet when he puts this up on Instagram. But I think that one should be cautious about yielding the point on things like the platform adding information that suggests that you are wrong, misguided, or potentially malicious in the content that you put up. I can understand getting to the point where Joe says, I'm okay with it. You know, he sends that to say, I'm great with it. I truly believe Spotify said this is what we're doing. And so you're good with it. You know, that's just the way the thing goes. But in terms of content creation, and like I said, I'm the recipient of a number of redirection messages under my videos, and it always feels a little bad. It always looks like Papa YouTube is coming in to say, oh, so you found yourself at some reactionary misinformation. We got you. Why don't you come on over here? And for the most part, I'm not talking about this stuff. It's because of references that the bots pick up in the algorithms and things like that. But I think we should be more careful with just yielding that ground that says, I'm fine with somebody putting a label on what I did and redirecting subscribers or followers or viewers or what have you to a different place. That there's a certain amount of moral and philosophical imperative that you give up when you say that's fine with me.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I mean, when I saw this, I just thought this is very on brand for Joe Rogan from what I've seen, you know, because it's just, he's very like, you know, open about, you know, whatever. I'm just a comedian. I'm just a knucklehead. I don't know what I'm talking about. You know, like I'm just having conversations, you know, kind of like he said in this video, but I've seen him say it elsewhere in other videos as well, you know, to say that like, he's like, don't get your political ideology from me. Don't get, you know, don't ask me who you should vote for president. Cause I don't know. Like, I don't know what's best, you know? So this still feels very on brand for Joe Rogan to say, hey, put a warning label on there. Sure. Cause I don't know whether or not, you know, the conversation that we're having is misinformation or whether it's actually true. And I think that like, I mean, like I said, it's consistent, but I understand your point though, that, you know, you do want to be careful about how much you're yielding in response to these kinds of things. And especially as somebody like Joe Rogan, who is actually in a position of power relative to other content creators on the platform.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine what I'd say with a $100 million contract in this particular relationship. But I feel like I would say is, you know, I don't love that, but it's their platform, and if that's what they feel they need to do, then that's what they feel they need to do. I mean, I can come to that kind of belief on those kinds of messages, especially if I'm getting paid by them and I'm a contractor for them. But yeah, that's what I would worry about. Otherwise, I think he said the right thing. I think if you want to believe Joe Rogan is an evil, malicious force, you can argue some of the things he said in this section, this 2 minutes, where, okay, I'm just a guy that wants to have conversations. That's fine. But don't discount the editorial power of selecting your guests.
That's true.
And I think he says the right thing. And I think he does a good job of saying, well, I also had Biden's advisor and these other people, and I think that's good. But don't pretend like you're completely outside of picking who you're talking to. You know what that substance is. And I think overall it's a good thing. Stand by it. Stand on the mountaintop and say I'm specifically picking people that do these kinds of things. But I think you could argue every time I hear that I'm just a comedian, my knee-jerk reaction is shut up. The only reason you're having this statement is because you said something of substance and now you're a little bit unhappy about blowback. I don't feel that from Joe, by the way. 99% of this, I think, is fine, and I think is correct. But I do look at that and say, yeah, you're deflecting a little bit. You're a little defensive. Don't blame you. I have thankfully never been a part of a national, maelstrom. So it's
yet knock on wood.
Hey, there you go. I'll tell you what. Yeah, if I ever have a size of channel with the Joe Rogan Experience, you're coming on. You could say something controversial, and we'll figure it out from there.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's
on the note of editorializing, though, he does get into that a little bit as we go on. So we can continue playing.
Or good segue.
All right.
If there's anything that I've done that I could do better is have more experts with differing opinions right after I have the controversial ones. I would most certainly be open to doing that. And I would like to talk to some people that have differing opinions on those.
Yeah.
So that to me sounds like yielding to some kind of fairness doctrine. That way madness lies. Okay, we already know this. We know this from how it was interpreted by the FCC. We know it from history in the United States. And again, I am very sympathetic to, I have a contract and we have a business relationship, and Spotify has called me and said, they're in a little bit of hurt here. Can you help assuage things? And that's what I think this is doing. But hey, I'm open to having some kind of fairness doctrine rule placed upon my podcast is not what I would yield ever.
All right. Well, okay. I mean,
you don't have to agree with me. I'm just saying what I'm hearing from him.
Yeah. No, that's, and I'm really glad that I have you on here, because that was not my thought at all. I mean, my thought was, he may have been thinking, all right, these people, and he says, I think right after this, that he actually is the person that chooses the people that go on the show. Okay. So he may be thinking, okay, I have a bias towards certain people, and those are the people that are contrarian. Those are, these other individuals, but maybe I can re-examine that particular bias and make things a bit more open to these other perspectives that he had a little bit of a blind spot to. That's kind of the impression that I got. And so, and we can all re-examine those things from time to time, right?
Of course.
I mean, we're talking about our analyses of various laws and policies and whatnot, and we all have our own biases. Of course. And so it's re-examining those and understanding where they are so that we can present things in a way that is fair, and doesn't sort of, shield or manipulate the information that we give to people, because we do try to educate the masses. That's always a good thing in my personal opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Voluntarily and re-examining those 100%. I don't disagree with anything of that at all.
Yeah.
I see it in a slightly different context with the whole controversy swirling around him, but certainly voluntarily deciding, hey, maybe I'm skewing too much. I liked what you said about contrarian, because as someone that is regularly been told I'm just kind of regularly anti-authoritarian, that's the kind of thing that absolutely you go, well, we can't just dismiss the authorities. We could make sure that we have that conversation more equally. I like what you had to say. I'm a little bit more negative on it just because I've seen how it's gone in other contexts. But if he's doing that voluntarily, I think there's nothing wrong with it at all.
Yeah. And someone in the chat says that I need to watch an episode of Joe Rogan fighting his own bias is what he's all about. I've watched multiple episodes. I've watched quite a few episodes of Joe Rogan. I love his podcast. And this is one of the reasons why this whole subject interested me. And so I understand that he's always trying to get down, and he says it in this video. In fact, he says that he's always trying to just get down to the truth, right? By discussing things with people, poking them with questions, prodding them with questions, to try to get to what is the truth. So I completely understand that. What I'm saying is that in this, I guess in the overall trend, his bias probably is towards getting people that maybe are voices that are not typically represented already, en masse, right? And so those tend to be the contrarian opinions. Those are the ones that are the most interesting, right? Because you don't hear about them often,
right? Nobody's asking the mainstream media, say, well, you've got a lot of people that say X is a good idea. I think you should have some people on that say it isn't. Like that. That's not part of the controversy, right? So we tend to say, something like this is, well, you should be more fair, but that's not really how our institutions operate. Right now, they operate as essentially competing forces, where you have a specific person on one institution say something and then they compete on the other, but no one expects them to have, what would I say? No one expects them to be fair and balanced. That's just not how it operates.
Right. So, anyhow, well, let's continue with this for a little bit
I'll try
longer.
to have more than 10 seconds before I yell.
Podcast in the future. We'll see. I do all the scheduling myself, and I don't always get it right. These podcasts are very strange because they're just conversations, and oftentimes I have no idea what I'm going to talk about until I sit down and talk to people, and that's why some of my ideas are not that prepared or fleshed out, because I'm literally having them in real time. But I do my best, and they're just conversations, and I think that's also the appeal of the show. It's one of the things that makes it interesting. So I want to thank Spotify for being so supportive during this time. And I'm very sorry that this is happening to them and that they're taking so much heat from it. And so now the Neil Young story. When
okay, so that's a funny place to pause, based on his face. But yeah, so all of that basically is saying that he's like, well, maybe I can open things up. I think that basically he probably is just so focused on doing what he's doing that it sounds like he doesn't really think on a daily basis about the scope and breadth of his podcast, right? The enormous reach, which, I mean, he has reminders of it every day, but I think that in order to do what he does, he probably kind of has to forget that quite a bit. It would be my impression.
Yeah, I think to operate, right? You can't think of 100 million people and 11 million subscribers. I mean, I could tell a story. I could tell it a dozen times actually that has wowed me, even on my channel, right? And we're a successful channel, but we started 3 years ago talking about video games, business, and law, and I have always and forever been surprised by the number of subjects of my videos, general counsels at companies, at video game companies, C-level executives that contact me and say, X, Y, or Z about what I was talking about, or, we appreciate your coverage, or you got this wrong, or can we have a phone call? It is very easy to forget in this context, this weird thing that we do. And no, we're not the Joe Rogan Experience, but we do put content out there regularly that when we make it, when we're sitting in our rooms, talking to each other, having a grand old time, that these commenters coming up on the side of my screen, they're real, that this is going out to real people, and that especially as the channel grows, I can only imagine 100 million people, that it gets out to a lot of people that have a lot of thoughts. And there's a lot of areas for misinterpretation. There's a lot of areas for ambiguity and clearing things up. And there's a lot of areas for malefactors. There's a lot of areas for people that if they want to cause trouble, that they can cause trouble, because if you're putting out a lot of content, you are on screen, you're talking, you're saying things a lot. And as human beings, you can make mistakes. Hopefully they're non-consequential. But I have a great deal of sympathy for that particular statement, even though I'm not quite sure I buy the unpreparedness angle. I've been involved in enough podcasts to get the show notes and the overall topics of what we're going to talk about and those kinds of things. Maybe he operates completely differently. But it would surprise me if he didn't have overall concepts for where he wants to go, and read a little bit about the nature of his guest and things like that. But I haven't listened to him. The last time I saw Joe Rogan of any substance, I was watching news radio. So I don't think that counts. But that one is the one where I get a little yellow flag that says, really? You're not prepared in some form or fashion, but maybe folks that have more specific experience with the podcast know it to be a little bit more freewheeling than I'm giving it credit for.
Yeah, well, now I can understand though how he says that at times he can be a little bit unprepared, because even if you have an overall understanding of the concepts for what you want to talk about, because remember he did say he is the one that is making the decision as to who comes on the podcast. And so he has to have some idea, right, about what it is that they're going to talk about. But I can understand though how And especially getting into some of these more controversial people that are coming onto the show, you can get into a very nuanced topic and really not know enough to be able to intelligently speak to it or even ask certain questions in the moment that then later on, after you're done, be like, you're in the shower and you're like, damn it, I should have asked this question.
Yeah.
I can see situations like that, as the podcast grows into this giant, monstrosity that everybody has a belly button. So everybody has an opinion about it, suddenly these little lapses of certain questions or certain topics that, otherwise would have gone completely unnoticed because of the scope and the breadth and everything that he has, that now he gets a lot of criticism for those sort of things.
Yep. No, I can see that. I can see that. I mean, look at this, right? Well, you asked me to talk about Rogan and Spotify. So what I did was I went over the statements, I went over the situation a little bit before the show, and then otherwise, it's where are we going to go with this? What is the form and format? What are we going to talk about? Because if there is value in a live stream or a presentation like a podcast, to me, it's in a certain amount of spontaneity of allowing yourself to talk about wherever the conversation takes you in the directions that it takes you, because you overly script it, you plan for it too much, it becomes very staid and rote, and it can't react to the answer that you just got. You see something, you hear something, go, whoa, all right, let's talk about that more. And to me, in the instances that I have seen clips of Joe Rogan, always as I've seen him presented in a negative light, I have been impressed by what I always consider to be good interviewing skills, which is taking the answer and then saying, oh, that sparks an interesting question. What about this? And doing that over and over and over again. I often give credit to Colin Moriarty, who I think is very good at that and who I interact with more regularly than Joe Rogan. But there are people that have that interviewing as a specific skill. That is, one part listening, 2 parts intelligence, because you have to actually have that spark of insight. But that's what I think of when I think of him from the clips that I have seen. He might just be underselling it a little bit. He's a little bit defensive there about, well, I don't quite know what's ever going to go on. It's like, all right. Okay.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair. So let me get some more super chats.
Sure. Look at you are super chat lousy. Your community is fantastic.
I know.
I think it's
Thank
great.
You. These guys, I love that they are supporting this so much. I so appreciate it. And every single live stream is always a great surprise when I start to get super chats from people.
Good stuff.
Yeah, always great. Cherokee Girl says, for Indy's appearance fee, thank you so much. I will put that to some dog treats for her. Dee says, I came here for the dirty toes, but stay for the law splaining. I appreciate that. Gusto Man 001 says, sorry if this is unrelated to policies like Minnesota Department of Health's restrictions of life-saving treatments on the basis of race have anything to stand on, or are they bait to sue the state? Thank you very much. So I don't know about those specific policies, but I have heard of them. I don't know if any places have actually put them into practice. Have you heard anything, Rick?
I want to say that there is either a pending or current new lawsuit. I'm not sure it was Minnesota or not. I tend to think from the very high level, the 30,000 foot view, that what has at least been described in terms of putting treatments and various things on the basis of race is pretty much prima facie on its face illegal under discrimination rules in the United States. Doesn't mean that's necessarily the way judges will go. But sure. That's the kind of thing where I think it is likely to get those particular localities in trouble. But we'll see what we see.
Yeah. No, I agree. Generally speaking, anytime you have a rule that, as you said, on its face, it discriminates between people on the basis of race, religion, sex, etc. Some limitations to that, but generally speaking, that is going to be considered to be unlawful, whether we're talking about the government or a business or an employer or all kinds of different places. So that's my gut says, unless there's more to it that would further nuance the discussion, if it's that simple, it seems like the kind of situation that would be unlawful. So, Britt Cormier says, who was the one journalist that called Joe an open racist? I want them to cite their sources in their brief to the court of public opinion. LOL. I agree. I have never seen anything personally, but I haven't seen every single episode of the Joe Rogan podcast. So
if you're online, I've been called things on Twitter, folks. They don't need proof to call you things, certainly.
That is very true. And the court of public opinion, as I understand it, doesn't even require briefs. So Carnell says, I've been a constant listener of JRE for 10 years, and he commonly states he doesn't pay attention to the growth or the comments because he knows they delineate from the way he does his show. Yeah, no, I that sounds about correct from what I understand. And so I think that these sort of situations present themselves to him as opportunities to evaluate how he's doing, right? That he doesn't necessarily consider how, his choice of people onto his show would affect the masses, or what have you. But I think that's why I think that, his response, I don't see too much of an issue with it, because of the fact that, this seems very much like him, is that, when there has been a backlash, he's kind of thought about it and been like, was I right or was I wrong? Is there some way that I can change, that I can get better, which I feel like is very healthy for anyone in any kind of employment context, whether you're working for yourself or for another employer. So Britt Cormier says, when he has politicians or someone in the news at the time on, he is much more focused. However, when he has just personalities on, he is more wider range of subjects.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that would make sense. And then Chuck Strum, thank you so much for your super chat.
Didn't even want to comment.
Very kind, very kind.
I'm impressed by the Legalbytes community. You guys are very generous.
Yeah. Isaac Bolt says, I like the JRE and have been following the pod for about 10 years. Having said that, he's been caught pretending not to know things he actually knows.
I'd argue that's the human experience as well. but you're caught between a rock and a hard place. Your daughter asks you how something works. You give a little dad answer. You research it later. But no, obviously that can be a problem if it's substantive. It isn't so much if you're just kind of BSing. I'd have to know the context to see if that was an issue.
Yeah. That's fair. So I think that, I guess the last thing that I, would say on this is that, when it comes to, I think that one of the best things that I like about Joe Rogan's statement here is that he's like, hey, if I make mistakes, I learn from them, right? I mean, it's a very human way to respond. And I think that, mistakes are how we learn at the end of the day. It's a very painful process, but it's true. And I think that the current environment makes it much harder to actually make mistakes. Whether it's, the global pandemic at large or social media. I mean, just like side note, I'm really happy to not be a teenager in the age of social media, right? Because every single mistake you make gets amplified to the whole world, right?
The whole girls do not have social media right now.
I mean, I don't even know what it's going to be like when I eventually have kids and then they become teenagers. If it's the way it is now, I mean, who knows what it's going to be like in however many, teenage years. But it is unfortunate that the current environment really is much less forgiving to people to make mistakes. But I think that, he really takes this situation, just like I've seen him take, previous situations in the past, to say, hey, maybe I made a mistake. Here's how I can improve. And I feel like that's very human, and you can really commend him for that. And I think that, at the same time, the people that are, on the, Joe Rogan is evil, misogynist, what have you, transphobic, racist, all of the things, right? The people that are on that train are likely to continue to think that way, regardless of what he says in these kinds of statements. But I personally applaud it.
Yeah, I think it's a good statement. And I think you're right that if you are biased, which we have to say that folks that just assume things about other people that disagree with them on policy preferences are, you can generally always frame your enemies and their statements in whatever direction you want to put them in. people are going to say things, and especially if you say things as often as Joe Rogan does, that you can put in a specific box and say, this proves my point, and call it a day. That's what we have to guard against. That's if you believe in battle of ideas, you believe in learning and growing through this kind of conversation, evaluating the rights and the wrongs. That's what you have to guard against. I assume this person is wrong. I assume this person is a racist or misogynist or what have you. Then you're going to be able to prove it to yourself, because that's how the human mind works. It pattern seeks, it recognizes, and it tells you what you want it to hear. We have to avoid that. And that's what I would see Spotify do. That's what I would see YouTube do. That's what I would see all these places that are these platforms do, because you can't evaluate the information without being able to see it.
Yeah, very, very true. Well, with that, any other thoughts before we head out?
Oh, yeah, I've got thoughts. I've got thoughts. No, I promised you. See, this was offline beforehand. But for those of you that don't know, I'll plug the channel at this point. Virtual Legality is a look at pop culture, video games, technology, software, and more through the lens of business and law. I'm a mergers and acquisitions venture capital attorney that loves video gaming and technology and software. So that's what we do over there. We talk about video games. So I had promised that I had a quote that I love, that I've always loved, that I was going to bring to the party here. Let's see if I could do this a third successful time. This is like using a business phone and making it work. For those of you that aren't familiar, in 1999, a game was released by the name of Alpha Centauri. This was ostensibly the sequel, give or take, spiritual successor to a game called Civilization, which continues to be very, very popular. And in this game, when you get a new technology, all of which are kind of future imaginated kind of concepts from these particular developers, you would get a long quote of philosophical interest. And the quote I wanted to leave you with on this particular topic, because like I said, we do video games, but we always make them practical for the news of the day, is a quote from the group that was actually, ironically enough, the UN peacekeepers that had lost their mission and that you were helping to colonize Alpha Centauri. And it was when you actually discovered a piece of technology called the data links that allowed people to know information. And when you got these data links, here's the quote that they gave you. And this is the last thing I'll say on this. As the Americans learned so painfully in Earth's final century, free flow of information is the only safeguard against tyranny. The once chained people whose leaders at last lose their grip on information flow will soon burst with freedom and vitality. But the free nation, gradually constricting its grip on public discourse, has begun its rapid slide into despotism. Beware of he who would deny you access to information, for in his heart, he dreams himself your master.
Boom.
Alpha Centauri, folks. A lot of good stuff in that game. Little old on the eyes for graphics, but you would not believe how much philosophy of governance, economics, and more is crammed into Alpha Centauri 1999. So I saw that, wanted to quote it here because it's always been one of those that I really like. Economics guy from college, lawyer from law school, obviously. Always love that stuff. So video games, modern discourse, can't get any better than that. That's the last thing I wanted to say. Check out Virtual Legality.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Legalbytes. I love having these conversations.
And I guess just one last super chat here. Very last one. Brick Cormier says, how about that move by Sony paying $3.6 billion to Bungie? What gets gobbled up next?
You know I have a video up on that already.
Of course. We should just direct them right to your channel.
Oh, yeah. See? So I have a video up on Bungie. I have a video up on how weird that transaction is. If you actually go look at the terms there, Bungie is telling the world that Sony has no control over it after it gives its founders almost $4 billion. Very, very bizarre. I talk about it at length yesterday. Also answered questions that people had in the comments and otherwise delivered to me today. So actually 2 video series right now. I am sure there will be more. We also cover Activision and Microsoft. I don't know. I think we have 7 or 8 videos up in that playlist already. If you're interested in those kinds of topics, come on over, subscribe. We will have you. Happy to be a member of LawTube, regardless of what Nick says about the titling, and to be invited here for these conversations. Absolutely.
Boom. There you go. Everybody check out Hoeg Law. His series on virtual legality, is great. You will learn so much by listening to Rick's videos, because he goes into such depth and he gives such great perspective on all of the subjects that he talks about. So for sure, go and check him out. If you haven't already, subscribe, check out a bunch of his videos. And with that, if you guys haven't already, be sure to like the video and share it and whatnot. And subscribe if you haven't already. With that, once again, my name is Alita. With me today was Rick Hoeg, and I will see you guys in